Should I swap places with you?
Well, are we recording?
Yeah.
Okay, let's swap places.
Let's swap places. I better bring my thing with me. Okay. Take your notebook.
Well,
Right. This is more like it.
so do I get to make more smart comments now than...
Yeah, and I have to do I have to take them?
No, you don't. Well, I'll explain since I'm a very professional presenter.
This is a much nicer side, actually. I like this.
I'm going to explain for our listeners,
Okay.
who are still the majority of the people. We have swapped sides, and Nicola has now gone into the interviewee side of the desk. Because
I'm nervous now.
Yeah, as you should be. Because she is being interviewed. We have a guest today on interviewing, trying to flog her new book, basically.
Yeah. Oh, God. Oh, stop. Yeah.
So-
New book, and we're also hitting the road with this Cocaine Cowboys. We have a new show, which we're going to be bringing in the new year.
Great.
But anyway, sorry, yeah.
So my new show will be coming up. And I might let Nicola.
Your new show, and I'll be like your special guest.
Yeah, well, not that special. But, no.
Okay, this is enough. That's actually abuse now at this stage.
Well, you have to take it as a guest on my show.
Okay.
But so the new book, Nicola, well, it's actually out, is it, this week?
It's out since Thursday.
Yeah.
And, it's a culmination, I suppose. Books don't come that naturally to me, I have to say. I'm sure you're probably the same.
Yeah.
You're sort of always going from one thing to the next and whatever. And the Cocaine Cowboys, it's what it's called, but it's actually like a culmination really of my work, I suppose, over the past 25 years.
Yeah.
More, like
because if
literally cocaine has been there in the ether since I started in crime journalism. And I kind of started with the sort of the first arrivals and all that, and then take a kind of a wider look at what it's all about.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously the people who were writing about crime probably a decade before, the heroin epidemic in Dublin was really the big story, wasn't it?
That's
like your
it.
kind of predecessors, it was, that was it, and then the beginning maybe of the ecstasy. But like as we were coming to prominence, let's put it that way, like cocaine really did, the explosion of cocaine really did change gangland it just absolutely incredibly. Now,
And very quickly, really.
very quickly.
I
mean, it went from, so your book starts off really with the first kind of guys who they were kind of, would be playboy gangsters. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah.
And it kind of, if you look at it, like, although they were obviously professional and, making a lot of money and all of that, they have a different feel, don't they? They were much less corporate, let's put it that way.
I mean, they're sort of like, they're fraudsters, they're VAT scammers, they're guys who are going to turn their hand to anything they think they're going to make money on.
Yeah.
And I suppose it starts really in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
And what you have is Ireland is sort of, shaking off its sort of cloak of poverty.
Yeah.
You're coming up to a period of time of wealth when the country's developing. You're having employment is obviously going to become almost, I think there was almost full employment at one point. You have the property boom. You have this feeling that Ireland is rich and it's party town, isn't it?
It is. And of course, the rave culture has changed.
Yes.
Youth culture in Ireland, like it didn't change it straight away, but it really, it started in Dublin really in the late 80s, very late 80s. But by the middle of the 90s, anybody who went into colleges or, lived in big towns in rural Ireland, they would have come across drugs, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and they were sort of drugs. I suppose the heroin, you'd never have produced heroin in a pub and shot it into your arm.
No.
There was this shame associated with heroin. There was, it was a drug that certainly even the users of it were ashamed of themselves for using it. It had all these stigmas attached to it. So I think ecstasy came along and all of a sudden that was a party drug and it was a recreational thing and it was something you did for fun and you did it quite openly in front of everybody else who was doing it at these raves. Yeah. And that opened the doors for drug taking for a whole generation who probably would never have gone down the road of taking heroin.
No,
So you've all these different things happening. You've also got, Colombia is producing more and more of the drug. Miami is the centre of it initially, where it's coming out of. You have Escobar, you have, you have all these sort of guys, some of them Irish, have made their way over to Miami and settled, and they have connections with the Colombians. You have also the Colombians have sent their own representatives to Europe because they're eyeing up the market in Europe big time. They've been flooding America for a long time, but they're kind of going, growth, let's look the other direction.
And so who were the first cocaine pioneers then, I suppose, in Ireland?
Well, ironically, one of the first sort of cocaine cowboys, as we call them, was Eamon Kelly, who was, of course, a paramilitary. He was part of the old Provos. He was somebody who shouldn't have naturally gone to sort of drugs. But I think, again, that whole idea of cocaine being clean, and it was only the rich who were going to take it, and sure, they were taking it anyway. And there was a nice little market there in the sort of the new clubs and pubs of Dublin. And he attempted to sort of set up a route between Miami and Dublin and got caught.
Yeah, I mean, it was,
I think on his first go.
Yeah, and it was kind of, if you look at the scale, like we I don't know what the final figure, it was 167 million found in a specially hired container ship just recently. But like the Eamon Kelly sting, like it was small scale, was it? But it was the first major cocaine haul in Ireland.
I suppose it's the idea of he's making the connections. He's going out to Miami. There's an Irish guy out there who is actually ultimately sort of double jobbing for the DEA to trying to infiltrate the Escobar network. And he's making that connection. And while I suppose the first flight, and it was literally a Cuban woman who carried it on her body as she came into Ireland. I mean, it was going to make him some money, but I suppose it was testing the route, wasn't it? And had the route been successful, he probably would have made hundreds of millions rather than nothing as he did. But he ended up in jail. He was very unlucky in many ways. And of course, he always insisted he had nothing to do with it, and you can relate that back to the Provos. Paramilitaries never wanted anything to do with drugs. So he's one of the first ones. Then there's also a really interesting character called Brian Wright. We were talking about him there because you did one of your first stories on him.
Well, it was one of my first ever crime stories anyway. Like Brian Wright was he was Mr. Big in the UK, wasn't he, for cocaine?
Absolutely.
But he was born in Ireland, and one of my first crime jobs was sent down to pull his birth cert. To find out where he was actually born, because you can pull anybody's birth cert. Some people would know, not everybody does. You can just go in and search through their name, and we had his date of birth, obviously, because of the court records. So he was born actually in Stoneybatter in one of the old terrace houses there. But he obviously ended up in the UK, I think, at an early age.
Yeah, I think about 12 he ended up in the UK in Kilburn, and the family, there was about 11 or 12 of them. They were brought up in grinding poverty. He somehow becomes very hungry for money, gets involved in gambling, and is kind of like really, really wealthy all of a sudden. He's mixing with celebrities. Jim Davison, the comedian, is actually one of his best friends. And he's this kind of very big and bold character, sort of very proud of his Irish roots and all the rest of it. But he's seen as a kind of professional gambler. Now, he does, certainly his wealth is causing suspicion. And when he gets a box in Ascot and starts inviting all these celebrity friends with him, it's like, how the hell did he get so rich? He must have been so lucky on the race course. But of course, he's actually made a connection with a Brazilian called Ronald Soares, who's introduced him to the suppliers. And he has literally decided he's going to ship cocaine directly from Colombia across to Dover is his plan. And
he's kind of a prototype, isn't he, for these guys? Because these guys, Irish guys, it's somebody who has the ambition to go over there and make a direct connection with the South American cartels, and then comes up with a way to do their own logistical transport of that cocaine. Because Brian Wright also did that, didn't he? He was probably a pioneer with hiring these yachts, wasn't it? And
Absolutely. And I mean, when you look at it, it's actually kind of simple.
Yeah.
When you think of the money, if
Yeah.
if you had that ambition and that, lack of moral compass, I suppose, you get an introduction,
Yeah.
you have the money, you come up with the money, whether he did or didn't come up with that through gambling, who knows, he could have borrowed it, whatever. He's that kind of a character that you can imagine he would have got that first investment.
Yeah.
And then he uses a fleet of yachts to transport it across the sea. Landing it into Dover is the plan, but of course that goes awry. In 96, the Sea Mist, a yacht, hit some bad weather in the same kind of area that the Matthew had or certainly the boat that was going to meet the Matthew had problems. But anyway, it ended up coming into harbour, coming into dock in Cork, and the crew acted suspiciously. They didn't raise their flag. Various reasons were given, but the long and the short of it, the Gardaí got on the boat and found this ridiculous amount of cocaine, which at one point was valued at 500 million, another point 40 million, and I think by the time it came to court, it was valued at around 50 million, and but there was intelligence gathered from that boat, which linked it to another sort of a kind of another maybe 6 or 7 yachts, which were all going back to Brian Wright.
Yeah.
And they realised, I think, from the intelligence gathered here in Ireland because of the bad weather, that Brian Wright was no more gambling to make his money. He was pulling in millions and millions and millions. Like at one point, it was estimated he was shifting 300 million in cocaine a year into the UK.
And like really the number one cocaine
Number
dealer.
one, absolutely. And called the Milkman. Did you mention that?
I do, because I always remember that because he always delivers.
He always delivered.
Yeah.
So Brian Wright is an interesting character, and he's there. And also I think it's interesting because of that early, use of the yachts to transport it. It seems really obvious. It is a straight line.
Yeah.
You either hit the coast of Ireland, England, or Spain, and you can find all these people out there working in the yacht charter industry, which is, it has good times and bad. You've probably risk takers working in that business, and they're being offered huge amounts of money to transport the drugs. Of course, the ones who are caught and who are left the hands on are the ones who end up in court. Brian Wright wasn't caught when the Sea Mist was caught, but I think what happened in the aftermath of it, the trials, only one of them pleaded guilty, actually the others got off, but it gave us a window into the kind of people that were being used to ship the cocaine back in those days, and I don't think much has changed.
No, I mean, the only thing that's changed is funny in the book where they're talking about buying extra binoculars for the Gardaí to keep an eye on the coast of West Cork.
They're standing in the Dáil in the early 90s, and they're kind of more concerned about cannabis, really, when they don't have a clue what's coming at them with the cocaine.
Yeah.
And they're getting a bit concerned. There is some cocaine has been found as well, I think in Rosscarbery, some of the bales of cocaine wash up on the beach and this kind of thing. And they're saying Ireland we've got so much coastline, of course.
Yeah.
And the TDs are calling for, have we enough police? And there's something like, is there 17 police working out of Cork at the time in the drug squad, and maybe another handful in Dublin? We don't really have a handle on this at all.
No.
And I think that happened across Europe.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Europe's borders were coming down, which was making it easier for the drug dealers to transport. So there's all these sort of parallel things happening. But yeah, they go, we need to get better equipped. Our lighthouses are no longer manned.
Yeah.
We need to get binoculars, really high-tech binoculars for our coast guards.
Yeah.
And the idea, the quaintness of that, the thought that you could fight
with an extra few pairs of binoculars. And of course, because you could no more fight that because it became the financial incentives for drug dealers just become so big. So if you move on then, I suppose one of the other bits that you first see, maybe the more corporate aspects of drug dealing or cocaine dealing, are what's called the Cork Mafia and their ties with George the Penguin Mitchell, who remains to this day somebody who's shipping in huge amounts of cocaine into Europe. They became one of the real first organised importers.
Certainly they did, and they're making a lot of money. They're based in Cork. They are one of the first gangs to disperse after 96.
Yeah.
So what happens is 96, you have this kind of cocaine is rumbling in. People are starting to make a lot of money. A lot of people are eyeing it up. Younger guys are moving into, are wanting a little piece of the action. And they bring with them, I think, a darkness that comes very quickly. And it all of a sudden isn't these kind of swashbuckling gamblers that are involved. But the Cork Mafia are one of the first to disperse after the establishment of the Criminal Assets Bureau.
Yeah.
They go to Europe very quickly.
Yeah.
Where many of them remain as big wholesalers.
Yeah.
You know, that legislation was brought in and it meant that the Irish state could pick through a lot of assets owned by some of them foreign criminals who are here, others being the likes of the Cork Mafia and others that were established. But ultimately, it sent them on a career trajectory. It's a little bit like, you know, if you were plodding along doing okay and something happened that you had to make a leap. We don't really like change, do we? But
no.
You know, you make a leap
it's
and
like
all of a sudden your career takes off.
It's like they all of a sudden signed for the Premier League after being League of Ireland. So you had a few people affected by that, like including Bomber Kavanagh.
Yeah.
And you had Christy Kinahan. Like, it's interesting, actually, Brian Wright, he became, one of the things that he became heavily involved in is the horse racing industry and caused a huge scandal there because it was clear he was paying jockeys for information, seemed to have inside knowledge, suggestions that, people were throwing races and into that mix then in that world, because like whether he presumably was making most of his money from cocaine, but he still couldn't help getting involved in the horse racing industry, probably for the social act. But once he's in there, he just can't help himself trying to fix a bit of racing.
And it was quite interesting because when I was researching for the book, I was talking to somebody in the horse racing industry and it had never struck me. It's pretty obvious actually, but it's ideal to fix races because you can make sure a horse loses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. You can absolutely make sure a horse loses. You can pull them back. You can do whatever they do, if they dope them or whatever. And that way you're guaranteed to be able to wash your money or to be able to win money or whatever. And he was running a bet to lose scam, Brian Wright, all the while. Now, he eventually, his operation, the Wright organisation, was eventually dismantled after much investigation by the British police and customs. He escaped actually to Cyprus for a long time and ended up back in court in the UK. And while accused of sort of running the Wright empire, this massive big cocaine industry, he was actually not bothered about that in court. No. He was more bothered that he was accused of race fixing.
He found
found that offensive.
Yes.
He was sort of this gentleman of the turf, or somebody who saw himself as that.
Yeah.
But I suppose the point of it all is that you're looking at horse racing, and obviously horse racing exists on this trust basis because the punters come to the race course because they believe that they have a chance of that horse they pick winning.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that there's fixing going on in the background, that jockeys are pulling horses or anything like that, it makes the industry null and void.
It does for the ordinary punter who takes their chance and puts their 50 quid on something, They need to know that they're...
And that's the lifeblood of that industry.
That is the lifeblood. And into that mix of horse racing comes in the Kinahan cartel. I mean, this is what year is that? I mean, that's over 20 years ago anyway, isn't it?
So that was certainly over 20 years ago, but I suppose it took a long time for horse racing to tackle what had happened in it. So while the Wright organisation was dismantled by the cops, in the background, the British horse racing industry was still struggling with what happened. And it took investigators to come in, and their own investigators to come in, and kind of like there was trials and some of the jockeys had to give evidence, and some of them were banned, some of them appealed those bans, etc., etc. So it eventually sort of washed its dirt out around sort of the early 2000s. And there was some sort of a report at the time, and British horse racing were sort of saying, hopefully at least the next, or sort
They've
of the
turned a
next
corner
scandal,
type
they've
of
turned a
thing.
corner, and there won't be any more of this cocaine or anything involved in it. And of course, the next big individuals to come in to be accused of the same thing are these two called Maurice Sines and James Crickmore. Unknown to us at the time, maybe, but they were big. They owned big caravan parks, and they had also been discovered to be doing this fixing races, and they're accused of that. And that's when, the report states, this is another big scandal for British horse racing, but at least this isn't cocaine money.
Yeah.
And of course, you move then
to
2016 when David Byrne is killed at the Regency Hotel, and there's surveillance on the Byrne household where the wake is happening, and the big man from England, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, who is the new Brian Wright. He's the big cocaine, cowboy in the UK. He's the head of the Kinahan organisation there. He comes along to pay his respects to his dead brother-in-law and his parents-in-law, because he's married into the family. And with him are these two men, Maurice Sines and James Crickmore, who had been trying to fix races some time previous, And Christie himself sent his son in, Daniel Kinahan, in to see what could be sort of taken, I suppose, from horse racing.
Yeah. And at that point then, when you have people like Bomber Kavanagh and Christy Kinahan, I mean, they're very different, aren't they, than the Cocaine Cowboys, if you want. I mean, a lot of what they're doing is backed up with a huge level of violence, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think really, when you look back, I think at the turn of the century, so, you come through the 90s and really by 2000 and the late 90s, the amount of money to be made from cocaine, the markup of it, because there is no other product in the world that by the time it lands in Europe has multiplied by hundreds of times in its value. I think there's so many people eyeing up that, looking at that. It goes very dark, very violent, very quickly. So you have the likes of Bomber Kavanagh, Christy Kinahan, and others who are at the very top of their game. And in order to stay there, the violence that they have to project down the lines, the fear. I'm not making excuses for it, but I think when you're dealing with young guys, I mean, take, for example, the Westies in Blanchardstown. They were only 18, I think, when they took out a major drug dealer. They took over that Blanchardstown patch. They were so ambitious. They were swinging people from the towers in Ballymun because they owed them 50 quid debt. They were burning people with cigarettes. They were using vice grips on them. They were this new breed, this really dangerous, volatile characters that were taking their product themselves along with steroids. I mean, plenty of people take cocaine and don't do the kind of stuff that they did. But these young guys are coming in, and I think to be controlled in a way, again, everything's happening, that the violence at the top has to be increased.
And you have to remember, all of the guns that came into Ireland in the 2000s, I mean, most of them are coming from the Kinahan cartel as well. So people only really focus on the cocaine, obviously, and the other drugs, but they were the major drug importers into this country. And if you look at the gangs that were associated with them, like the Dundon McCarthy's, which were directly associated with the Kinahans, or the Crumlin Drimnagh feud, I mean, they were all guys who were hitting 30 years old, who had an incredible access to weapons.
Yeah.
And I mean, those two gangs fought wars that cost. I mean, I think at one point you're describing those early to mid 2000s, we had over 20 murders, gun murders as a regular basis each year.
Yeah. And every so often something would happen. It would spill into, these gun murders would spill into kind of middle class areas, and there'd be outrage, and it'd be brought up in the Dáil. Part of the Crumlin Drimnagh feud, there was 3 murders within 48 hours at one point. And that did become, a topic of conversation. The opposition, of course, are, pushing the government, saying that this country's going out of control, that, somebody has to get a handle on gangland, they have to do this, they have to do that. All the while, in the background, you have this growing, demand for cocaine, which is coming from the people, coming from, polydrug users. They watch cocaine, the kind of the medical end of this, they're watching cocaine, and they see it going from a really high class drug, sort of in the beginnings of the 90s and the 80s, to starting to move into normal society, into normal middle class society, and it's crossing every boundary.
Yeah,
it's being used in working class areas. It's the one drug, I think, that does that. And then you have these weekend users, who are doubling the profits for the cocaine dealers are making a fortune during the week anyway. And then they have this big, huge boom in profits at the weekend.
I mean, actually, your book opens up with, it's a court case involving a teenager. I think he's 17, is he, in Galway, and he's caught with, I can't remember exact amount.
Well,
but
it's like 60 grand's worth of cocaine.
60 grand's worth of cocaine. And, he's obviously dealing it to people in that local area, and it's kind of like no big deal, really. But, that would have been inconceivable, wouldn't it, at some point 20 years ago, maybe, or so?
Absolutely.
I mean, that would have been national news, that amount of drugs at all. Where now it just becomes a sidebar, does it?
And people still sort of are, saying, you often hear headlines, cocaine is in every rural pub in Ireland. Yes, it is, and it has been for quite a while. The availability of it, the demand for it, the money that we have as a society, because Ireland's very rich.
Yeah.
Europe's a very rich place and has all this disposable income that it's using on fun.
Yeah.
You have Professor Dr. Colin O'Gara, who I spoke to up in the John of Gods, and he's suggesting that this, our love of cocaine, shall we say, is almost in our DNA.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
we like having fun. We like chatting. Life is stressful.
It's a complicated debate, actually. But I mean, Irish people have had high rates of alcoholism historically, and then even Irish immigrants who've gone to other societies have retained that high rate. But not only are we the highest consumers, but we also became, as a nation, I think there's a funny interview, isn't there, with Sandra Vaughan. I don't know if you remember this, where she said, we should be really proud of Daniel Kinahan. Yeah. He's come from a really normal working class, and he's become a world star.
And she meant in the boxing.
She meant in the boxing, right? And that's what she did mean.
And that's why we found it amusing.
Yeah.
However,
if you were to be a totally amoral person, you would say, like, he did become a major player in the world. Like, how did that happen? How did those guys who in around the 2000s were teenagers hanging around Oliver Bond causing hassle, how did they become, in the space of 2 decades, one of the biggest producing cocaine gangs in the world?
Like, it's extraordinary. I mean, Ireland is definitely punching above its weight as a small little nation on the international stage. When you think that our Kinahan cartel are, the subject of sanctions in the US. How it happened, listen, it's complex how it happened. But ultimately, I suppose, it was a gold rush.
Yeah.
They were very perfectly placed, because you had Christy Kinahan at the top of the organisation, and he's already made the connections.
Yeah.
By 2000, by the late 90s, he's based out in Amsterdam. He's travelling between Amsterdam and Spain. He has his sons coming of age, along with all their sort of friends and compatriots from various parts of
soldiers, basically.
Soldiers. Yeah. Absolutely. And he brings them out and he sets them up in Spain, and they start running the operation. And they actually initially started making big bucks out of cannabis.
Yeah.
They made connections with Morocco, with Moroccan dealers, and they were shipping it over and collecting it on the beaches of down the coast.
I don't know if you saw Top Boy. You didn't watch Top Boy?
Yeah, I've been watching it, yeah.
And you see that they're actually doing that.
Yeah.
Where the Moroccans landed on the beach and the guys rush out, grab it in, put it in jeeps and sped off. And that's how they started.
That's how they started.
Yeah.
And of course, what you have again is, look, whatever. You have Curtis Warren, who was there and was a big, major, player, and he goes to jail, and Christy Kinahan is perfectly placed to sort of step into his shoes. They're supplying the UK market, they're supplying the Irish market, they're becoming wholesalers, they're offering a kind of a money laundering service.
Yeah.
I think that offer of that money laundering service that we got a little bit of a glimpse at in 2010, that really brought them to a top table, because you have to keep being ambitious.
Yeah.
And I mean, we could see even, around the time of the sanctions and just before that, Christy Kinahan, his ambitions are never ending.
Yeah, they're limitless.
Limitless.
And
he wants to take over the route of the cocaine, which is the most really important part of the trade.
Yeah.
Second most important thing to the transport routes, or second most important to the production of it.
Yeah.
And he is making inroads in taking over that African corridor.
Yeah. And becoming effectively independent once he just gets the cocaine from the jungles and from whoever supplies it. I mean,
and he's moving to Zimbabwe, isn't he? And he's going to relocate and reinvent himself there. And I mean, I don't think we can underestimate. We talk a lot about Daniel Kinahan these days because he's the guy who really put himself out there.
Yeah.
He's the guy who sort of was in the background fixing fights for Tyson Fury and became this sort of celebrity, sort of gangster in the boxing world and all the rest of it. But he was gifted a lot through his parentage.
Yeah.
And I mean by his father, not his mother, because she was not involved in criminality. His mother, Jean Boylan, she actually came home to die in Oliver Bond in the flat, the council flat she had. But his father had laid a lot of groundwork for him and his young guys, you know what I mean? The young guys he brought from Dublin out to Spain, and they started making millions. And listen, they started making the money with the cannabis when the cocaine came in.
Yeah.
I mean, we were told in 2010 that organisation was worth 100 million, right?
Yeah.
By the time 10 years later, the US come in to sanction them, they're worth $1 billion.
Yeah.
And that's after they're supposedly being dismantled.
Yeah. And I mean, they of course, they've like a lot of these major gangland figures, they move from their hometown, they end up in Amsterdam at some point, Spain, and then they end up in Dubai. And everybody is in Dubai at a certain level, aren't they? And that's really how they come together in this super cartel, which we've written about.
Yeah.
Like who are all these people? And
well, they do. And I always think the most interesting moment, the scene, I mean, if you were creating a drama around this, you'd be talking in scenes. And one of those scenes would be the wedding of Daniel Kinahan and the Burj Al Arab, because that's where they're all together. Ridwan Taghi from the Dutch Moroccan outfit, Rafael Imperiale from Italy. Enrico from Chile, and you have Eden Gassanen from the Balkans.
Yeah.
And they had all come together with Daniel Kinahan, and he was the brains of the operation, apparently, the formation of the European super cartel, which was really just everyone bringing their specialist, be it money laundering, be it transport routes, whatever, to the table, coming together, cutting out some middlemen and just helping one another out and sharing the profits, setting the price, of course, in Europe. But at that wedding, of course, was an unwanted guest, the DEA.
Yeah.
Watching on, and it's an incredible scene. I remember when we eventually found the one photograph that exists from inside that wedding, and it's up the cake.
Yeah.
And it's so opulent.
Oh, I mean, like it's in that hotel. I mean, you can't even imagine how much the whole thing cost.
No.
And I mean, I remember as well. Then we had a video, didn't we, of Daniel Kinahan then was it Kazakhstan? At a charity auction, spending 100,000 on a football.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's that level of disposable income.
Yeah, and that's where I think they start disconnecting from reality. And of course, you would if you're living in that. Yeah. But it's interesting for me, that wedding, because it's bigger than just the opulence and the spend at it. Everybody's there.
Yeah.
Johnny Morrissey's there, who we first discover in Kinsale in the early 1990s, living down there, under the auspices of being a businessman, when really the Gardaí suspect that he's actually going out and meeting Russian ships who are delivering cocaine to him.
Yeah.
You have all these various characters who have been sort of milling around the whole cocaine ether, and they're all there together at that wedding. They're all there. And they're all back together as such.
And feeling a bit untouchable, it has to be said.
Yeah, for sure.
However, what is it, 6 years on?
Yeah.
They're not untouchable, are they?
They're not untouchable. I mean, there's still an open-ended investigation going on into the Kinahan organisation. We know that the file here is with the DPP, that we are going to be asking the Emirates to hand back Christopher Jr. and Daniel. Listen, they're not going to beat the state, and they're not going to beat the Americans and everybody else who's after them. That's the only guarantee we have in all of it. They are not going to come out of this winners.
Yeah.
But of course, the inevitable is there's all these other people to take over from them who will take over from them. The next Daniel Kinahan is probably being born as we speak.
Yeah.
But I think we were talking about those sort of other wider issues that go around it, because of course there'll always be somebody to replace them. Of course the war on drugs is unwinnable. But what I suppose we talk about all the time is how the corruption that sort of emanates out of it is constantly filtering and threatening society and communities.
I just watched Get Gotti on Netflix. I don't know if you saw it, right? Yeah, it's really interesting. Like obviously crime in America hasn't stopped.
Yeah.
But this is about John Gotti who came to, he was the head of the Gambino family, America's biggest organised crime group. They eventually dismantled it. But you can see how they managed to corrupt every aspect of New York society at that stage. Yeah. Now, the Kinahans maybe didn't do that to Irish society to that extent, but they did do it to boxing, didn't they?
And I think you could safely say they're doing it in the Gulf.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they're doing it. They are being protected out there. They are friends with politicians. They are friends with all sorts of high society. They are getting a protection there.
Yeah.
I don't think that protection is never ending.
No.
I think it will come to its end. But yes, they've done it in boxing.
Yeah.
We talked briefly there about horse racing. There's fears for football.
The Dutch Moroccan gangs have done it to society over there, I think it's fair to say.
They have threatened certainly all aspects of society, the judiciary. I mean, another aspect I look at in the book is these big hacks, these phone hacks, and what kind of was discovered in them. And of course, the biggest thing, really the biggest eye-opener, I think, for Europe that was discovered in them was the corruption of port workers, of people involved.
Yeah, low-level government officials.
Exactly, and police and everybody. And that corruption is like a cancer. It's seeping in constantly. Yeah. And I suppose cocaine brought that.
And the money.
With a tidal wave,
Okay, so I'll ask you a compliment, because you always throw me with one unexpected question.
Oh, no.
So what are you in 20 years' time?
Oh, jeepers.
When you're writing your next book, what do you think the situation is going to be? Are we going to be able to go down to the local shop and buy a gram of legal, safe cocaine? Are we going to have a crime-free society as the war on drugs is won in 2032? Are everybody going to be addicted to cocaine? Nobody ever takes in it again? Do you have any thoughts? How it could all go? And I know.
I'll be writing my next book in a year, by the way.
You're right.
Not 20, but I suppose looking into the future, and it's always really difficult to do that.
Of course, because if you look back at when we're talking in those 90s, you wouldn't have predicted. No.
Wouldn't have predicted this.
No.
But I think there's another while in the cocaine and the growth and the demand and the supply. And I think it's like a balloon that has been blown up and it's not quite ready to burst yet. There's still a little bit of movement there.
Yeah.
But I think if we're looking to the future, what we should be really concerned about is what's coming next.
Yeah.
And that has to be fentanyl if we look at what's happening in the US, because everything that happens there ultimately happens here.
Yeah.
I mean, even when, I taken cocaine as a subject, as a topic, and you can see Europe is about 10 years behind the States in the sort of, the drug use and the types of drugs. A lot of synthetic drugs. I think the Chinese are very much developing components that go to make fentanyl. It's probably easier to transport. It's probably easier to make outside.
Yeah.
And therefore, do you need transport? Can you make it in?
Yeah, I mean, this is it.
In factories and a lot of these things.
Will somebody be able to synthesize a cocaine-like drug?
Of course they will.
Yeah.
Of course they will. And while we're chasing constantly the transport routes now, we're going to be chasing the factories, the underground establishments where it's being made, here. And yes, I think they are definitely going to be able to synthesize cocaine. And it probably will be a boring old drug, back, for the oldies.
And what about the demand in society? Like, do you think people are going to rethink that? Or, we have public health on cigarettes that maybe brought down smoking, though we've then vapes pop up, of course.
I know, yeah. I mean, there is certain things that you can tackle with some marketing. I think that the more information people get, and I think, you know, I don't know, do people grow up? I mean,
People
the
grow.
whole generation coming behind now that will be, you know, looking for something else. Underlying issues are so complex. The use of drugs, why people use drugs. And I think, in a way, Dr. Colin O'Gara is right. I think life is so stressful for all of us that it's kind of handy to have something that'll help you relax, and whether that be a glass of wine, you know, a gin and tonic, a line of cocaine, weed, whatever it is, people are going to go for that. And life is just very, very stressful. So there's all these underlying issues that we'd need to tackle. And also people take drugs because of traumas and you know.
100%. And I mean, why do people get involved in drug dealing? And mostly it's young men in pretty hopeless situations.
The drug dealing, I mean, I think that is terrifying for people living in communities. I think that's got so much worse. I think certain aspects of communities have been completely broken down because of cocaine. Yeah. You know, and
I think as well in my time working in the Sunday World, you've seen it seeping younger and younger.
It is.
And that's really scary.
And people always ask you, you know, oh, has it got more violent? And you kind of go, well, it was always violent. But actually, when you look at Drogheda, and when you look at
even Finglas that we were talking about in terms of that flashy feud.
Absolutely. And that whole idea even of everyone's game now. You know what I mean? It's not just that old school thing of man-to-man combat and stay away from the families and all. No. The families are game. The sisters, the partners, the mothers, everybody is game. And they don't give a shit. You know, and of course, you've that coupled with the amount of firearms in the country. So, you know, it's not a bright future.
No. But look, it'll be different than what we think. I mean, that's always the way. It's very hard to predict, but what drives it is not going away.
Yeah. And apart from the book being out, as I mentioned at the beginning of it, we are going on the road with Cocaine Cowboys. We're back on the road with Crime World and a live show, which is going to be...
Do we have the dates?
Well, we have the dates. Do I have the dates? February. Anyway, we're going to be in Limerick, in Cork and Dublin, the Olympia. And I think we're going to do a second round in April when we are going to Killarney, which we cancelled the last time. Because we had taken too much on. We're going to Killarney, we're going to Galway, and we're going to Belfast. And we might possibly, depending on how we get on, do another gig in Dublin.
So and we don't even know how
it's exciting. It's going to be really exciting.
And you know, I like this seat. Maybe could be my seat in the future. No,
you're back out of that.
I got you in the end.
All right.
One awkward question.
Well, thank you.
Well, actually, Nicola, it's up to me to end the show.
Oh, sorry. God.
So thank you very much, Nicola.
You
were a wonderful guest.
I noticed I didn't get any coffee. I always get you coffee and a bun on a Friday. All right.
So thank you very much, Nicola. You did okay.
Thank you, Mr. Donald. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.